Alhamdulillah wahdahu amma ba'du. In the next part of the book, Dawkins attempts to employ the best of his literary skills to get the reader to buy into the Darwinian myth, choosing a telling subtitle, The Slow Magic of Evolution. It's telling because it quite literally sums up the kind of trick he's about to pull before the reader's eyes to compel them that it is indeed possible for the breathtakingly magnificent variety of complex life forms that we observe around us in the world to have all come to exist from absolutely random, unintended, accidental origins. He uses the term magic because he knows whatever he does, he would never be able to mute down that deep, natural sense of awe and amazement that we all feel whenever we look at life on Earth, wherever we find it. There's no doing away with that, no matter how deeply committed you are as an atheist. That sense, of course, is not a fluke of nature or some blind, unintended byproduct of some evolutionary process in early hominids, as Dawkins would explain it. It's the way of the Lord to remind people of His might and His infinite resourcefulness as a creator. There's evidently no limit to the variety that He can create by choice within certain bounds of unity that He intended, A, and no limit to the varieties in the kinds of unity that He also chooses, B. There are two levels, of variation here. Just look at how very subtle differences between the features of two identical twins can always give their parents a clue to tell which is which. No two members of the same family within a single race or subspecies in any species are ever really identical. No matter how much they look alike, you will always be able to tell the differences. No two humans have the same fingerprint. Can you even begin to imagine how many human thumbs there are on this earth right now? No two humans have the same retina. No two humans have exactly the same voice. Even the two halves of your own body are not identically symmetric. No two humans have the exact same physical stature, or the exact same proportions between their body parts, or the exact same complexion, or the exact same hair distribution on their bodies, or the exact same cranial shape, or the exact same proportions of facial features, etc. And that's just in humans, brothers and sisters. One of almost 9 million different kinds of living species that have thus far been discovered on Earth. Now, you might think that that's all the kinds of species there are. Well, far from it. Scientists still describe about 1,000 new species each year to this day, and it doesn't seem to be getting any scarcer. It's not just a mind-blowing variety in distinct species, there's subtle variety between every two closely related members of the same species as well, to an extent we cannot even begin to imagine. Now, I remember I once read an outrageous comment by British evolutionary biologist J.B. Haldane on the fact that there are over 400,000 different species of beetles discovered thus far, where he said, if a god or a divine being had created all living organisms on Earth, then that creator must have an inordinate fondness for beetles. Now, obviously, that's the comment of an atheist trying to be funny, but he's merely trying to cover up his sheer astonishment with the magnitude of creative variety that the Lord has indeed exhibited stupendously in just one kind of insignificant bugs that populate the Earth. An exhibition is what it is, brothers and sisters. An exhibition is what this is. Indeed, the greatest show on Earth. A show of creative prowess, of knowledge and wisdom, and an incredible challenge to all created creators, who have been as arrogant and stubborn as Haldane. No unwritten and unspoken message has ever been any clearer. سنريهم آياتنا في الآفاق وفي أنفسهم حتى يتبين لهم أنه الحق. We shall exhibit our portents to them on the horizons and within themselves, so that it would be abundantly manifest unto them that it is indeed the truth. If you were tasked with creating 100 or let's say 1,000 units of the same artifact, doing generally the same complex mechanical functions, and let's say extremely complex mechanical functions, and were assigned to make it such that no two units would look exactly the same, despite still being identifiable as the same kinds of artifact, doing the same kinds of functions, with, of course, an additional assignment to make sure that none of these units might one day be mistaken for any one of a plethora of different kinds of artifacts that you've created before. Let's say hundreds of different kinds. Okay. you would definitely lose your mind before you've reached the point where you have indeed managed to make each one of 1,000 different units of the same kind of artifact look unique despite the essential unity. Can you imagine the challenge here? Can you even begin to imagine what it means for there to be almost 500,000 different subspecies of beetles alone? A kind of bugs whose bodies only consist of a bulbous abdomen, another piece on top of it, a thorax, and a tiny head with 6 limbs and 2 wings, 2 pairs of wings. Where from would such an astonishing variety emerge, and to what end? And to what end? Even more astonishing are the subtle color varieties that exist within every one of those subspecies. The tortoise beetle, one of 40,000 different kinds of leaf beetles, comes in a myriad of splendid colors: shiny blue, green, orange, red, and even gold flecks on an otherwise transparent pair of wings. Now, that's just one of countless other design challenges that no human designer can even begin to take. Now, we can speak volumes about the wonders of molecular life inside the living cells of those species, and we're still just scratching the surface, so to speak. It's resoundingly obvious to every self-respecting man that this is but a show of ultimate power and creativity. He's just giving us a testimony of what he can do, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And yet look at what someone like Haldane here would attempt to take as evidence against divine creation, teleology, and wisdom. If there were indeed a God by whose power such an incredible variety came to be in such an insignificant creature, then why would he choose of all living things to make it such that of every 4 different kinds of living species on earth, one is indeed a beetle, a species of beetles? Haldane used the term inordinate precisely to allude to that objection. But does it really qualify to be an objection at all? What do you mean by inordinate anyway? What, may I ask, would be the ordinate proportion of kinds of living species on Earth in your estimate, Haldane? The degree of hubris and arrogance in such a comment is simply unconscionable. These people really do deserve to spend an eternity in hellfire when the day comes and they stand accountable for their deeds. All the signs imaginable and unimaginable of their Maker's creative power are abundantly clear literally everywhere. By no means would they hold that he doesn't exist or doesn't deserve to be worshipped without committing all kinds of laughable fallacies and rational atrocities. They have even been given an explicit warning unto the prophets of their Maker that if indeed they insist on dying as disbelievers, they would go to an eternal fate of damnation. And yet they just didn't bother. They never bothered. Rather, they spent all the resources that God had given them in attempting to rationalize their outrageous beliefs against Him, and even to invite believers in Him to accept them, to accept those rationalizations, those excuses, those theories, those sophistries that they created. And when someone warns them against what should happen to them after death, they just make fun of the idea of the rebellion against His almighty name, amounting to a crime so huge that it deserves an eternal punishment of hellfire after death. Inordinate, I believe, would also be the word they would use in such an objection. Why? Well, because it's basically the same objection, brothers and sisters. They'd start, implicitly of course, by analogizing their Maker to themselves, and then would consider what they would do if they were in His seat. Yep, that's right. They would basically imagine what a human would do if he were to create the universe and be its Lord, and then produce their judgments against their Maker from them. Does it make any sense at all to argue, for example, that if I were to create a world like our world, I would probably not decide to populate it with that many species of beetles? Obviously not. Absolutely not. Once you acknowledge the personhood of your Maker and the fact that He necessarily knows what He chose to create better than the smartest of all humans, and that He is the only one with epistemic authority over the complete set of ends, purposes, and reasons that He's had in creating every little detail of the world the way He did, rather than otherwise, you will admit that that knowledge is exclusively His, and that it cannot be deduced by analogy. It cannot be deduced by analogy. The reasons you create, whatever you create, are by necessity fitting with your place and your rank in existence as a limited creature, governed by laws and bounds you cannot break or overcome. and constantly subjected to events you have no choice or control over, and with barely inferred knowledge about what tomorrow may or may not bring unto you. Knowledge that you could easily be wrong about. Okay, it could turn out to be ignorance, not knowledge. That's the kind of being you are, and that's your place in the world. Like it or not, you're not a god, you're no god, and you can never be one. Whatever ordination you may determine for things of your creation would necessarily follow from that fabled, lacking, wanting state of existence that is characteristic of your kind as a creature. The kind of personhood that you enjoy, through which all your choices, your judgments, and your knowledge are conceived, is that of a limited creature, necessarily. One that is bound, restricted, and governed by rules they have no control upon. Now, the personhood of the Maker of all things, on the other hand, is necessarily of a higher rank, the highest of all, where knowledge is eternal, not gained, all-revealing, not proposed, theorized, or inferred, and where will is unrestricted, unbound, undictated by need or obligation, with no one to answer to, and nothing to fear from, and where power is unlimited, ultimate, and with no higher laws of causation or regularities of nature to define it or to restrict it. He is the ultimate lawgiver, both in nature and in legislation, the ultimate purpose giver, and determiner of what is and what ought to be. So the mere idea of judging his wisdom and intent in making things the way they are, based on some human norm or reference in the purposes that humans have in doing what they do, and making whatever humans make, is by necessity a sheer fallacy, an outrageous fallacy. So if you consider for a moment what could be the kind of reasoning that Haldane exercised so he could come up with such a silly objection, you would find that it couldn't possibly be otherwise. A false analogy. He just had the audacity to think of his Maker as though he thinks of some fellow human. Ordinate or inordinate, according to whom, you would have to ask. With respect to whose knowledge exactly, and in line with whose ends and purposes of creation. Those of a limited creature like you and me, or those of the King of Kings, the Creator of all things? Obviously, we will never enjoy the power, nor the knowledge, nor the wisdom befitting the Creator of all things, including ourselves. So it follows necessarily that whatever preferences you may have about the way the world should be like are the preferences of a limited creature, in all the respects and dimensions we mentioned above. Every creature would, of course, prefer to be in a world where everything goes their way, bringing them all the pleasures they desire, and keeping them clear from all pain and all suffering. But we're not in such a world. We're not in a world that was created according to the preferences of each and every one of us, are we? It wasn't created after the wisdom of some human being, neither was it created to please a particular creature or a group of creatures, no. So when you find yourself wondering, for example, why of all kinds of species you find beetles enjoying the greatest variety of all, you should keep in mind that you're inquiring about knowledge that is way above your pay grade or your existential rank as a human being, and that unless the author of that splendid variety chooses to tell you, you will never learn about it on your own. You should be humble enough to admit this. Haldane, however, was too proud, too arrogant to just say, we don't know why the Maker of all things had that choice. Why beetles in particular, not some kind of birds or fish or whatever? You wouldn't dare then quit that it's an inordinate fondness, qatalak Allah. If you had that kind of humility, you wouldn't dare say that. Now the same is true of the question of why he would choose to determine a punishment and penalty of eternal damnation in hellfire for those who refuse to worship him and submit themselves to his messengers. It's too great a punishment. They would even make fun of the idea itself. I mean, Elon Musk once quipped in a tweet of his, in sheer arrogance, that if indeed it turned out to be true that he's going to hellfire if he stayed on his course, then it probably wouldn't be that bad, considering that most of humanity, including the greatest minds in history, would be going there anyway. So he would be in good company. Okay. That's what he said. It was in response to a fellow Muslim who invited him to embrace Islam and to consider his fate after death. That's how he responded. One common route that Muslim scholars would take in response to such an objection would be to show that indeed choosing to worship one of his creatures, thereby raising them by entailment to his rank, subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the worst offense that a creature can commit against their maker. What makes it even way greater, way worse, is that those who deserve that infinity of horrendous punishment, that infinitely horrendous punishment, only become deserving of it after they have been warned against it, not before. So those are people who are not only cool with committing the greatest insult imaginable against their maker, they are too arrogant to pay any heed to the warning that his messengers have given them due to that. So obviously, they do deserve the worst punishment he can afford. However, this answer lacks a very important component, brothers and sisters. People need to be told that it's not up to them to decide what sin is worse than what other sin in the eyes of their maker. It's not by the knowledge of a human or by the wisdom of a man that such determinations and designations or ordinations are made. Of course, we can sense in some general manner that certain deeds are graver than others, worse than others, and that in some respect dealing with human earthly consequences or with the evil of man against man, we can indeed identify a certain order in severity of crimes, which would imply a proportional order in earthly punishment. This innate sense of objective morality is what our scholars would call التحسين والتقبيح العقليين. However, we have no right to claim that whatever we humans decide is the bigger crime should indeed be considered as such in the laws that our Lord chooses to give us. Why is it a much bigger crime in his eyes for some creature to dismiss the message of one of his messengers and insist on dying on shirk, than for that very same creature to murder another creature like himself unjustly, for example? Why does it matter that much to him who worships him and who doesn't? Now, the answer to such a question would simply be to remind the inquirer of the vast difference in rank between the personhood of a limited creature and that of the maker of all things. He did not create us for a purpose of our choosing, but of his own. We're not here because we chose to be here, but because he chose to put us here. So while the laws he chooses to give us and the penalties he assigns in them will necessarily agree with our innate sense of objective morality, somehow, wherever we can safely consult it anyway, they will also and by necessity align with his own preferences as a Lord and with the purpose he has chosen for his subjects in this world, not with their preferences in life or with the purposes they would choose for themselves. So a sin that challenges the very reason he gives you, the very air you breathe, for one that you insist on committing even after knowing how grave he sees it and what kind of penalty he has designated for it, such a sin should of course be billions of times worse than one that includes injustice against other creatures, like yourself. And of course, any sin that degrades his words and his laws or insults his messengers would be way worse than one that insults lesser beings. Now, he likes to be worshipped, obviously, to be glorified the way that he is due, and he hates nothing more than he hates being insulted in any way. That's just how grand he really is, and he really should be. He is the only being in existence deserving of endless self-glorification and self-praise. You see, when a human praises themselves, we find him guilty of arrogance and self-righteousness. Why? Why do we judge him as such? Because, well, he would simply be claiming a place he does not deserve. He would be speaking as though his merits are his own creation, as though he needs nothing and nobody to keep them for himself, and he never needed anyone to earn them in the first place. Now, obviously, that limitedness he dismissed is characteristic necessarily of a creature. Okay, the limitedness of a creature. That's not at all true of the maker of all things, the giver of all life and of all merits that a creature may enjoy. The same fallacy of analogy underlies the so-called problem of evil. In reality, it's not a problem of evil at all, it's rather the problem of some arrogant humans deciding that the world should favor them in every way and be as they prefer for it to be, not as the Maker chooses out of his own wisdom and his own ends to make it. They decide that that's what they want the world to be like, and if the world is not like that, then we have a problem with his existence, with the one who made it. Why didn't he make it the way we like it to be? That's what it all boils down to. Okay, so quit putting yourself in the place of your maker. Learn your limits as a human being and your place as a bound and restricted creature in his vast kingdom, and immediately the so-called problem would disappear. The sad fact, brothers and sisters, is that rather than seeing the immense splendor in the variety of species for what it is, a clear, unmistakable sign of infinite power and incredible creativity, atheists have chosen to explain it away by claiming that the longer a species has endured on Earth, the more likely it is to have developed a greater variety of subspecies due to random mutation. The more time you give to the whole myth, the more likely, or at least the less unlikely, it becomes. So why 400,000 different species of beetles? The short answer would be 350 million years of evolution. That's it. They have allegedly endured through 2 major extinction events. And thus, in place of the magic of divine creation, you get the magic of evolution, as Dawkins seeks to convince his readers here. But is this really an explanation at all? Much less a magical explanation? I'm not going to show that in their natural history, Darwinians do have species that have existed in the oceans for at least that long, and yet they have very few subspecies, unlike beetles, because a Darwinian could easily come up with some alleged explanation of the exact same kind for that difference, making everything up as he goes, as neatly and with good internal consistency as they never fail to do. Rather, I'm going to show, as I've been doing thus far, how manifestly false and unwarrantable a Darwinian explanation is, in principle, and more importantly, for this particular occasion here, I'm going to show how deflating and fundamentally defeating it is to the real majesty and magical grandeur of creation that every sane human being feels whenever they contemplate the beauty and richness of life on Earth. We generally feel that something is magical when we realize it cannot be imitated by any of our crafts or with any of the resources we can acquire. So to claim that given enough time, the magical splendor of life would have emerged anyway, that obviously contradicts the notion of magic at a foundational level. We're not thus witnessing an unsurpassable feat of creation, rather we're witnessing whatever happened by pure chance to be there for us to observe when we came around. Okay, where's the magic in that? None. Unless, of course, by magic you mean something coming out of absolutely nothing. Something coming out of nothing. Which is the bottom line of naturalism in general, brothers and sisters, not just of Darwinism, although it manifests more blatantly in Darwin's theory than in any other. Naturalism is basically the notion that nature is self-sufficient in complete causation. But what is nature anyway? Well, it's roughly speaking the orderly regularities of causal behavior that matter exhibits in the world. How matter affects and is affected by matter. Okay, so what is matter what is matter now? Well, it's the different classes of material things that we observe in the world. That's matter. Now, obviously, however, no single event that is caused by one such thing on another can be regarded as completely caused معللة بذلك تعللا تاما يعني, because in order for it to happen at all, other natural events had to take place before it as they did. So the idea that nature as such, which boils down to the cosmos or the world at large, is causally self-sufficient, implies infinite regress in causation, which ultimately means something out of absolutely nothing. Now the world should not exist at all if naturalism were true. The world should not exist, nothing at all should exist. Nothing at all should come to be. Darwinism adds to that pool of nonsense the idea that intricate, mind-blowing order and beauty that we observe in life is fundamentally random and unintended in its origin. Now, given enough time, sheer randomness should give rise to impeccable order and beauty no matter what. Okay, that's what he's trying to convince us with. But randomness is the absolute absence of any will, meaning, purpose, plan, or intent whatsoever, brothers and sisters. The information underlying order that would make it happen, no matter what, is not a property of matter itself, obviously. Not a property of matter itself. No naturalist is willing to concede that matter or nature as such did anything or had any foresight or plan or intent or information of any kind as an intrinsic property that would thereby beget creation or develop the world as we know it. The very notion of things existing in different types with different orders and properties and natures inherent in them should be impossible under naturalism. Impossible, since there would be no agency to determine what kinds of matter should exist and what should not and why. And since we obviously have a world and have an order in it and have systems, then naturalism is false. Okay, by implication. None of those things that we see is necessary in any way. It's also it's all contingent. Every part of it, every kind of it is contingent of matter. Okay, it could easily have not existed at all, or could have existed with different properties or in different amounts than we find them. The world could easily be entirely different, an entirely different place than we know it to be. So why is it not? Because nature dictates it? Nature is no agent to dictate or determine anything. Nature is the law, not the lawgiver, not the lawkeeper. Nothing can create itself or cause itself to be, obviously. No sensible man should accept the notion that such could be the origin of all things. Out of nothing, nothing comes, brothers and sisters. Now, some contemporary naturalists thought about this and decided that the only way out of it is to claim that there really is nothing at all, believe it or not. Okay. There was never really anything to require creative agency of any kind. Never really anything at all. British chemist Peter Atkins once argued that just that, employing quantum mechanical interpretations, if I remember properly. This reminds me, brothers and sisters, of a similar trick that Zeno of Idia and his teacher Parmenides pulled one day, a couple of thousand years ago, to fool themselves and others into monism. What's monism? The belief that space, time, and motion are nothing but a big illusion. Everything is just one single thing. One single thing that has no distinctions, that has nothing moving, that has nothing changing. We think that we move when we do, and that things around us move from one place to another through time, but in reality none of that is true. How did he argue for this nonsense? Well, he said, look at an object as it moves. Think of it as having to traverse a certain distance in space. Now, we would normally think that this object traverses a certain distance in space in a certain interval of time, right? Alright, now, what if that interval was divided into an infinite number of parts? Each is to be traversed in 0 time. Then, Zeno reasoned, there would be no motion at all. The object could also be thought of as traversing a distance in time x, a certain distance in time x, then half that distance in time y, then half of that in time z, and so on and so forth, until the traversed distance tends to 0 and time tends to infinity. He argued that since we can think of motion as such, then no motion actually occurs in reality. See where the trick comes from? Sheer arrogance. Since I, the philosopher, can think x, then x. It's over. That's it. It must be x. How can it not be? If you can think about it too, then you will have to believe me. How can you not? You see? Now, the fallacy here is obvious, brothers and sisters, and the Western Academy has been committing it since its inception in ancient Greece. If it makes sense in my mind, then reality must obey it. Now, the division that Zeno and his teacher imagined in their minds is obviously purely abstract. Purely abstract. It has nothing to do with the way things move in reality, and yet they both decided it must determine something fundamental about the reality of motion itself. It must be some kind of revelation from the realm of the abstract or something like that, teaching them something fundamental about the cosmos. That Pythagorean Platonic belief about the philosopher's abstract thought and where it comes from has been implicitly there in the Western tradition since time immemorial. If it's mathematically beautiful, elegant and such, then it must be real. The heliocentric model must be the truth only because it's mathematically simpler and more elegant than the geocentric. The metaphysical explanation of the orbits of planets being the way they are must be exactly the same as the explanation of an apple falling from a tree, just because the philosopher managed to apply the same set of mathematical expressions to both phenomena. Acceleration must be the exact same phenomenon as gravitation ontologically and metaphysically, for a similar reason, because we can describe what we observe in both phenomena with the same mathematical expressions. There's really nothing that you can't convince people about if you manage to express it in a set of equations that appeal to the prevailing metaphysical trend in the academy. After all, no one can dispute mathematics, right? No one can dispute it. Physicists can now argue that something can exist in two contradicting states simultaneously, or that it can exist distinctly in two places simultaneously, or that it can run back in time, or that it can cause the existence of a number of parallel universes where every other quantum possibility did in fact occur, or that it can only exist when we're observing it, something exists only when you're looking at it, or that we're all living inside a huge computer simulation, or that things move in space whereas space itself moves in nothingness, as in the theory of cosmic expansion, all in the name of good mathematics. Okay, just put it in standard mathematical form and it will pass as science. So why not argue that reality itself is a big illusion and that nothing actually exists at all, like Atkins tried to do? Now, similar tricks have been pulled by major giants throughout the history of the academy and have gone unquestioned. That's exactly how Darwin himself defended his theory when critics started to accuse him of taking an unwarranted leap of faith in the kinds of analogies he adopted. He simply said, "All natural philosophers have been doing that forever. So why not let me do it too?" Now, we've shown in previous parts that the concept of ontological randomness upon which Darwinian evolution is founded is but a giant fallacy of mental projection. Fallacy of mental projection. In this case, a projection of ignorance. If I, the philosopher, can't identify some purpose or function of something that I find in nature, then it must be functionless, pointless, unintended, and unplanned. Again, another instance of the Platonic hubris. Reality must conform to what I think of it at all times and in all ways. Empirical science, brothers and sisters, is not supposed to follow this Greek arrogance, this Greek sophistry. Yes, there will always be certain beliefs about the unseen that I obtained from sources other than systematic observation, and I will always have to start from those beliefs at a foundation level. However, it is essential for every empirical researcher to be able to identify those initial beliefs and to tell where exactly each one of those beliefs comes from, to him. Now, apart from what religion teaches from authentic scripture, there can be no learning about reality at large, or about the fundamental nature of all things, or about the origins of all things. Not through observation, nor through mathematics or any other route that philosophers have been trained to take. It is the Western tradition of theory that is in question here. The tradition is such that it turns the awe and wonder that we feel about the way the world is into an amazement with the way this or that philosopher was able to explain it all away as something fundamentally trivial and insignificant at its very core. It's just a bunch of tiny particles that have been moving around at random for eternity. That's all that it boils down to, right? In praising the magic of reality and the magic of evolution, Dawkins is not trying to arouse your amazement with the way things are, but rather with the way the philosopher claims them to be. It's the magic of the theory, not of reality. That's what the book is all about. Indoctrination requires a leap of faith, and that's what he's trying with all his might to give to his readers in this book. He says, to turn one complex organism into another complex organism is in a single step, as in a fairy tale, would indeed be beyond the realms of realistic possibility, and yet complex organisms do exist. So how did they arise? How in reality did complicated things like frogs and lions, baboons and banyan trees, princes and pumpkins, you and me come into existence? See how he starts by establishing the premise that creating what he calls a complex organism in a single step is a fairy tale material, and would indeed be beyond the realms of realistic possibility. He uses the word indeed to confirm the claim, making it sound like a necessarily true, self-evident claim. But is it really? What do you mean by the realms of realistic possibility? If by realistic possibility you mean that such things you mentioned could be caused to exist by purely natural causes of the kinds we commonly observe, then yes. If by realistic possibility that's what you mean, then yes, of course it is physically impossible for something that like that to happen. However, physically impossible and physical possibility are model judgments that only come from the limited scope of our accumulated human experience, unlike rational possibility and impossibility, which come from rational necessities. Dawkins here is trying to trick the reader into mixing up the two things, into treating natural possibility or physical possibility as rational possibility. You cannot claim that nowhere in the universe exists a certain nature in certain things that does relate complex things as such in one step. You can't claim that. We have never observed it, obviously, but who's to say that it does not exist? Much less that it cannot exist. That would be an unwarrantable leap of faith, obviously. Absence of knowledge is not knowledge of absence. And that's just talking about the natures of things as previously defined. Causation, however, is not necessarily natural as such. When you, a willful agent, decide freely to do something, you're not exhibiting an inherent nature in your body, the way fire is inherently a cause for heat, for example. No, that's not how will and what comes out of it works in human beings. There's no room here to refute determinism, of course, with respect to human free will, and neither do we need to. The point I'm making here is that events are not necessarily the outcome of simple natural causes. This is clearly a naturalist trying to impose his naturalistic beliefs onto his readers. Once you've granted him the belief that it is impossible for something complex to come into existence in one step, then it becomes a necessity that Darwin's gradual steps be the truth of how all complex life came to be. If nature is all there is, and nature cannot create in one step, as human experience tells us, then the argument goes, things must have come around in gradual baby steps over a very long period of time. However, nature itself did not come to be through natural processes. That would be an obvious case of circularity leading to infinite regress. It is part of the nature of a computer device, for example, to display colors on a monitor. If you inquire about the way that nature itself came to be, then it would make absolutely no sense to claim that it was created in the computer by means of processes that are among the natural functions characteristic of that computer itself. It would make no sense at all. Rather, it must have been one of those natures that were built in the computer upon its creation. That's what it was. It was built with it as part of the different functions that it does. Of course, the world is not a machine, and natures are not mechanical functions inherent of a machine. The biosphere is not a part of a machine, as Newton's metaphor would hold, and as we've discussed in previous parts. However, even if for the sake of the argument we assume them to be, then there's obvious circularity in claiming that the natures of something created one. There's obvious circularity in claiming that the natures of something created one another. These natures created one another. There has to be an external originator of the entire system from outside of it. A willful agent who has the necessary knowledge that determines what does what and how. Now, otherwise, there would be no such thing as a system or as natures to begin with. So the most that Darwin did really was reduce the creator of life into a blind, ignorant creator who did invent a natural order in physics and chemistry of the world, somehow, but failed miserably at bringing about the variety of life that we now know in a similar manner. Now, bear in mind, of course, that back then, at Darwin's time, the notion of the entire cosmos having followed a similar process of slow evolution was not there yet. The agency of God was still required to build the system, the physical system, where the long process of evolution allegedly took place. Eventually, however, Darwin started to think that one day fellow naturalists would come up with similar theories that would replace him altogether, and thus he died an agnostic. It wasn't a stroke of genius that he made such a prediction. The mill was already running in that direction, as every natural philosopher was well aware back then. And now, not only do we have a blind creator who invented life unintentionally and with no foresight, we have a creator who generated the entire cosmos in exactly the same manner. Things moving around at random, and blind laws of nature determining what they do to each other. That's how it's always been, according to naturalism. The Big Bang Theory and the theory of evolution now provide the closest thing a naturalist has ever hoped for in terms of placing natural mechanism and ontological randomness where divine teleology and wisdom used to be. Darwin would be very happy if he were here today. He definitely would have declared his strong atheism on the spot. The question that Dawkins is raising here, brothers and sisters, is not supposed to be a question of science at all, methodologically speaking. How did all complex things come to be is a question that only the willful agent who chose to make all systems, all order, and all complexity and all simplicity, whichever way you choose to define them, the way they are, has the epistemic authority to answer this question, to answer here. We don't share power with him. We don't have access to his knowledge. We have never witnessed the intentional creation, the initial creation of all things in any other worlds like our own. So we lack the basic data that would grant us any right to turn this into an empirical question and propose theories to answer it. The way Darwinian generates explanatory hypotheses on this subject matter is fundamentally fallacious from the word go. Alright? The suggested details of the scenario of natural history will forever remain nothing but suggestions and conjectures, because we will never be able to acquire the data needed to provide for a proper inductive background from whence good hypotheses can be generated, and will never be able to even acquire all the data needed to see the picture as it really is. When a good crime investigator studies a crime scene, he refrains from making theories until he has acquired all the necessary data, right? Once he has, he then resorts to his inductive experience with similar cases to come up with a good explanation for the particular case in question. Okay? Now, in Darwin's theory, however, the theory was invented with very scarce observations, relatively speaking, and continues to be modified in countless ways with every new fossil observation that comes along. Plus, of course, there is no inductive background of similar crime scenes to back up any hypothesis of common descent or otherwise, and there can be none. The fossil record will never be complete. All Darwinians know that, and yet they insist on building theories upon observational data that they know is neither complete nor will it ever be. This is clearly not good empirical science here, not good empirical practice. So why are we required to treat it as one? Well, because it serves the naturalistic doctrine in ways no atheist thought possible before Darwin. That's why. Listen to Dawkins as he states in sheer arrogance. He says, for most of history, that was a baffling question which no one could answer properly. People therefore invented stories to try to explain it, but then the question was answered, and answered brilliantly in the 19th century by one of the greatest scientists who've ever lived, Charles Darwin. What question do you mean by a baffling question that no one could answer properly, Dawkins? The question of how complex things came to be, as it was never a scientific question at all to begin with. Okay, and it's profoundly irrational to turn it into one. Empirical science is about what we experience, what we can test, what we can observe, not about the origins of all things that we observe and those that we don't. Baffling as it may be, it was never up to a philosopher to invent an answer to it, that question, and neither should it be. By inventing stories, he obviously refers to different stories of origins that people of religion believed in. Alright, now believe it or not, Richard, those people, even those of them who worship a totem or an idol of their own making as a symbol of some being they glorify, are far more sensible and reasonable with their origin stories than Darwin and his followers would ever aspire to be. At least they ascribe to some claimed story of divine agency in creation, some willful giver of all order and beauty. They believe that nothing can come about from ultimate randomness, and that blind order that blind matter cannot keep any order. This belief alone places them orders of magnitude higher in terms of rationality and reasonability than that brilliant answer you're so happy with, which boils down to the idea of everything out of nothing at all, everything emerging out of nothing. At least they were honest enough to acknowledge and admit that there is some higher necessary being worthy of praise and gratitude for this bountiful creation of his. فالحمد لله الذي جعلنا مسلمين.
قناة إقناع فيما نرجو.
سحابة خير أمطرت على أرض جرداء
تحمل من كل زوجين اثنين،
المؤمن والملحد،
الضال والمهتدي،
الموقن والشاك،
فأنبتت بما تحمله من ماء الحياة حيث نصوص الوحيين
ثمار اليقين في قلوب المؤمنين،
وصقلت بذات الماء قلوب المعاندين.